Okay, good morning, people. I've gone back to this presentation on the McCulloch's-Pitts neuron, which is an abstraction. It's an attempt to show what neurons might be doing, and much of what McCulloch and Pitts proposed is the basic idea, I guess, is still accepted today. But this is not exactly how neurons work, and in some important ways, it's different. And it's also not exactly how the artificial neurons that we use in artificial intelligence work today. One moment, 10 seconds. Out you go. Okay. Uh, so I thought we'd do a review because I know that this can confuse people who um, haven't seen this kind of thing before. So on the left, I have two neurons, and on the right, we have what are called truth tables, incomplete so far, one for or and one for and. So or is a logical operation. If I have A and B standing for propositions like Anne is home and Beth is home, was it Anne or Amy? I'm going to say Amy. So Amy is home, Beth is home. Then you can use or to join them together. And that's called a disjunction. So you say either Amy is home or Beth is home. And the truth of the statement, the whole disjunction, either Amy is home or Beth is home, depends on the truth of those parts. The first one is Amy is home, and the second one is Beth is home. And just by assigning values, truth values, to those parts, you can use this table to figure out what the truth value of the entire disjunction is. Okay. Now, we don't, of course, do this. This just happens naturally. If you speak English, you don't think this way. But if you wanted a machine to compute this function, as we might say, to go from truth values of the two propositions to a truth value of the entire disjunction, you need a table. Okay. And the same goes for and. And the disjunction, either Amy is home or Beth is home, is going to have a different function than the conjunction, both Amy is home and Beth is home, right? Okay, so here's what we do. We exhaust all the logical possibilities for those two propositions. And we start with zeros, which represent false. And so you have 0, 0. That's the situation where neither of them are home. And then in the next case, you have 0, 1, and then 1, 0, and 1, 1. And 1 stands for true, right? And if you've taken symbolic logic, then you probably did not use in ones and zeros. You probably used T's and F's for true and false. And you probably went through the list in the inverted way, where you started with true, true, and then ended with false, false. But that doesn't matter. We just have different conventions. And this is actually following binary. So if you were counting in binary, you'd go 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1. And then if you continued, it would be 1, 0, 0, whatever. Okay. So now we have a convention for going through all the logical possibilities. And all we need to do is assign ones and zeros based on the ones and zeros on the left. So we're going to go under the A or B, which is right here. The wedge, by the way, is the logical symbol for or. And we're going to assign values. And it looks like that. And intuitively, you just know this, right? So if I call up and say, is either Amy or Beth home? And you're in the first case where it's false that Amy is home and it's false that Beth is home, then you'll say no. But if you're in the second case where it's false that Amy is home and it's true that Beth is home, you'll say yes. If you had to say just yes or no. Of course, normally you'd probably say yes, Beth is home, but not Amy. And in the third case, Amy is home, but Beth is not. And so you say yes. And in the fourth case, if I say, are either of them home and they're both home, it would be very weird if you said no, right? So if you have to say yes or no, you say yes. Now, sometimes we use or exclusively. So we mean one or the other, but not both. Sometimes context makes that clear. Like you're talking about the rabbit following one of two paths, right? We all know that it doesn't split in half and follow both paths. But the default is the inclusive or, where you say yes when both propositions are true. And that's made clear because that's the default. Because when you want to go away from the default, you actually say but not both. So when you want to make it clear that you're using the what we call the exclusive or, then you usually have to add but not both if it's not already clear from the context. Okay, so we want a gadget to act like that. So whenever A and B are false, we want it to give false for the disjunction. And when in the third case, when A is true and B is false, we want it to be true and right. We want to follow this table. And looking over here at the neuron, the question now is, um, whoops. I guess following my slides, let's look down here at conjunction. That should look different, right? And conjunctions are true only when both of the parts are true. We call them conjuncts, actually. So conjunctions are made of conjuncts. Uh, and so you just get a one in the fourth case when both of the parts, both of the conjuncts are true. False in every other case. Okay. So we want two gadgets that work like that. And the first one has a threshold of one. Remember, it takes inputs and uh, often the inputs are weighted, but in this case, the weight is just one. And so it's going to take an input of either 0 or 1 from A and either 0 or 1 from B. And the threshold is 1, which means whenever it gets at least one input, it will produce an input of 1, an output of 1, an output of 1. Okay. So A alone is sufficient for making it produce an output of 1. And B alone is sufficient for making it produce an output of 1. And if both A and B send in their inputs, then it adds up to 2, and 2 is greater than 1. So again, it'll produce an output of 1. The only case in which it will not produce an output of 1 is when both A and B are silent, when their inputs are zeros. So 0 plus 0 is 0, and it's not equal to or greater than 1. So it doesn't meet or exceed the threshold. And so it produces 0. And it needs to work differently. You need both A and B to be sending in one input each, and that adds to 2. So the threshold for the and neuron or net is 2. And that's how you get these very simple gadgets to perform or to compute or and. But we have other logical operations. Now, if you took symbolic logic, I'm sure that you never bothered with like the majority operation, right? But you did do not, so we'll get to that. Uh, but there are all kinds of things we can compute. So a majority out of 3, majorities are always half or more. I mean, sorry, more than half, not half or more than half. And so a majority out of 3 is 2, and a majority over here out of 4 is 3. A majority out of 5 is also 3, and a majority out of 10 is 6, right? So you just go find the halfway mark and add 1. And so what would the threshold be for the majority net on the left? Well, it would have to be 2. And on the right, it would have to be 3. Okay. So give me green checks if this all makes sense. And if you don't feel like you can give me a green check, then ask yourself uh, whether you have a question to ask me.
Is there a half check?
No, there's no half check.
Okay.
Do you have a question though?
Well, I do. I understand the Geordie net. I think I'm a little confused on the slide we just covered um, about was
Oh,
it?
this one?
Yeah.
Okay. And I see Darla has a red X. I can go through it again or wait to see if someone wants to ask a question.
Yeah, if you could go over it again, if no one else has a question.
Yeah, and I see that now I see two X's, and a lot of people just aren't giving green checks. So these are people that I think, if they were braver, would give a red X. um, and then in the chat, sorry, yeah, I don't even know how to ask a question properly. Okay, um, so maybe I'll make a video on this, uh, but let me go through it one more time, and uh, maybe I'm thinking about it, whether I can approach this a different way. Okay, so people, I'm going to clear the feedback. Oh, there's more people with red X's. I'm going to clear the feedback. Um, let's start with the truth table over here on the upper right. Um, this is just a lookup table. So let's say you didn't know what the word or was. You're learning English, and and someone gives you this table, and they say the zeros stand for false, the ones stand for true. A stands for Amy is home. B stands for Beth is home. Um, and this tells you what the truth value of the disjunction is when you know the truth values of the parts. So if you want to know, like, is it true or false that Amy or Beth is home? So in the chat, I'm going to write that. Uh, so here's the disjunction. Either Amy is home or Beth is home. Okay. And that's one sentence, but intuitively it's made of two independent clauses. Not intuitively, it is made of two independent clauses, which could be sentences on their own, right? Amy is home, Beth is home. Okay. Uh, and you're told whenever you disjoin two statements, in other words, put an or between them, and maybe you put either at the beginning, which signals that a disjunction is coming, but you can drop that. Uh, whenever you disjoin them, the truth value of that statement, the whole thing, the disjunction, depends on the truth value of the parts. And the table shows you how it depends. So when it's false, false, or zero, zero, the truth value of the whole thing is zero. But when at least one, in the three remaining cases, when at least one is true, the whole thing is true. Now, and works differently. Again, imagine that you don't know what the word and means. They say you can take two sentences and you can create a conjunction. Both Amy is home and Beth is home. And the truth value of that entire thing depends on the truth value of the parts. And the table tells you how. The table says it's false no matter what, unless both parts are true. Okay, now green checks if you get that part from everyone, please. Oh, good. Thanks for the feedback, Darla. Yes, Zaw. And is more demanding, right? It requires both conditions be satisfied. And we all know this intuitively, right? If I told you, if you called up and said, is Amy home and Beth home? And I said, yes. And you said, okay, can I speak to Amy? And I said, she's not here. You would be, you'd be like, what? Right? Uh, can you go over again how to find the threshold number? Yeah, that's where we're headed, Grace. Okay. So I got only green checks, but I still have a lot of blanks. I'm going to clear that. Okay. So far we're just given tables that tell us how you can determine the truth value of a complex sentence based on its parts. Yeah. And And now we're going to do the thresholds. Okay. So A can contribute either a 1 or a 0. B can contribute either a 1 or a 0. And those logical possibilities are exhausted right here on the table. And they're down here again, same exact logical possibilities in the same exact order. Okay. And so now we just need a gadget, a McCulloch-Pitts neuron that has the right threshold to behave like an OR net. And so the um, the threshold is 1 because all you need is either A or B to be contributing a 1, as the table shows, for the whole thing to produce an output of 1. So the output's here, and the output's going to be either 0 or 1. And in the first case, the output is 0 because 0 plus 0 does not meet the threshold of 1. It's below, right? But 0 plus 1 is 1, and that meets the threshold. And 1 plus 0 also meets the threshold. And then 1 plus 1 is 2, which exceeds the threshold. And in all those cases, it produces an output of 1. Green checks, if that made sense, please. I said on day one, this is not the typical philosophy class. We do like a little bit of, this is some basic logic and computer science, just very foundational stuff. We do some neuroscience, etc. Okay, so that's encouraging that I've got a lot more green checks. I do see that one red X. Okay, um, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say, well, what if the threshold was 3? What if the threshold was 3? Then you'd look on this table, and for 0, 0, 0 plus 0 does not meet or exceed 3. So you have to put a 0 over here on the right. And then on 0, 1, that's 1. That doesn't meet 3 either. So you put a 0. And then on 3, 1 plus 0, the third row. That doesn't meet 0. So you get 0. And then 1 plus 1 is 2. That doesn't meet 3. So it would just always be 0. That would be a weird function, but you could have that. What if the threshold was 0? Well, then for every case, you would have a 1. Now, we've seen that OR has a threshold of 1, and it will then act according to this table. And then we now see down here that AND must have it needs to act differently, because OR takes you, in the second case, from 0, 1 to 1, but AND does not. AND is more demanding, requires more. The threshold needs to be higher, right? Because 1 should not be sufficient, but 2 should be. 1 plus 1 is 2. And we need, in that case, the output to be 1. And so the threshold is going to be 2. Do all OR nets have a threshold of 1? That is such a good question, Grace, because the answer, if you're talking about just 2 items being disjoint, like A and B, or P and Q, or C and D, then the answer is yes. But we could have 3 ORs. We could have either Amy is home, or Beth is home, or Charles is home, right? And for OR, that's still going to have a threshold of 1. Okay. But if you ask the same of AND, it's going to work differently. And so far we've only seen, they call these OR nets, but you might say OR for A and B, and then OR for B and C, another one, and OR for C and D. And then you could also have OR for A, B, and C, and OR for A, B, C, D. Yeah, I hope that helps. So the threshold is really the maximum number of options when answering the question. I think you might have the right idea in your head, but I wouldn't express it that way. Um, the threshold is how many inputs need to be providing a one, an input of one instead of zero, in order to get this thing to produce an output of one, which is once you interpret it, how many statements need to be true in order for the whole complex statement to be true. Does that work? How many basic statements like A and B need to be true in order for the whole complex statement like A or B or A and B to be true? Nice, nice. Okay, good, good. And I'm all I can say right now because I'm worried that I'm going to be way too busy, but uh I would like to make a video on this. And but I maybe it would be redundant. Maybe you could just watch what's being recorded right now. And maybe my time would be better spent making a video on something else. Uh, I'll think about it though. If there's a new way of presenting it, I'll do that. Uh, Madeline says you can also think of the zero as false and the one as true, and then run it through the statement. Yes, that's what I was trying to do. So there's, um, and that is what the zero represents, the zero and the one. Um, yes, I will release the recording, and I did post last class's recording this morning. Yeah, and I went back and I noticed that recordings from a previous week hadn't been posted, so they're now posted. Okay. So I encourage you all to do what Madeline just said, to go back and forth between ones and zeros and true and false, right? And make sure you can do that. Because if I say, just what's a majority out of Amy, Beth, and Charles? Well, at least two of them have to be home. So if I say, are most of those three home? Is the majority of them home? Then it's got to be two or more, right? Uh, And so the threshold for a majority out of three, well, that's going to be two. And the threshold for majority out of four is going to be three. And it doesn't matter. Notice that you lose information, right? When I say a majority of them are home, you don't know, is it Amy and Beth? Is it Beth and Charles? Is it Amy and Charles? Is it all three of them? Because this one treats uh, the totality as even if they're all home, that counts as a majority. Some people would quibble with that, but that's how we're doing it here. So you lose information in this case, and you lose information in the previous cases because um, when I say they're both home, you know Amy is home and Beth is home. But when I say no, they're not. It's not the case that they're both home. You don't know which of the cases is true. You don't know if they're both not home, or if Amy's not home and Beth is home, or if Amy is home and Beth is not home, right? And in the or case, when you ask, are either one of them home? And I say yes, you don't know which one is home. So sometimes we lose information. Okay. Now, so you can do a lot with just activation, ones and zeros, and set the threshold, um, and keep track of how many inputs you have. Is it just A or A and B, or is it A, B, C, or A, B, C, D, right? You can do a lot, but you can't do everything in logic. So we need not, and not works differently. So not does not have an arrowhead at the end. It has a ring, and that means inhibition, which means that when A is active, then it inhibits this net or McCulloch-Pitts neuron. So the neuron is, if it wants to fire, then the activation of A makes sure that it doesn't. Okay. So it's important to remember, in addition to excitation, we have inhibition. And the inhibitory circuit has the empty circle instead of the arrowhead. And when A's value is 1, the neuron yields an output of 0. And when A's value is 0, it yields a 1. Okay? Because its threshold of 0 is being met. I know that's hardly anyone gets it the first time around. Really. Some of you get this, and some of you have seen this before, I'm sure. Just statistically. But a bunch of you are still scratching your heads. So if you don't get it, don't get self-conscious about that. You're not alone. Okay. So so let's step away from just look at the neuron and its threshold. Forget about A and the ring and all that. Just look at the neuron and its threshold. The threshold is 0. So what's it doing? Well, is it getting enough input to produce an output of 1? Yeah, because it's 0. It doesn't need any input to produce an output of 1. So left to its own devices, this net will just always be producing 1 output unless something interferes. Okay, so it's, I like to say it's listening to, right? So this neuron is listening to the neuron that detects whether Amy is home. It gets input from the neuron that detects whether Amy is home. Okay. Whenever Amy is home, neuron A, which is just a label here, it's not pictured, is activated. It has an activation of 1. Okay. And whenever Amy leaves, it goes to 0. Okay. Now, what does this neuron represent? Does someone want to tell me? If A represents Amy is home, what does this neuron represent? It's a not net. So it performs the not operation. In the chat, Amy is not home. That's right, Atavia. Atavia. Uh, and good. So whenever this neuron pictured here is active, it's saying Amy is not home. And that activation depends on what the Amy is home neuron is doing. And they're always going to give different values because that's how not works. So whenever the Amy is home neuron is active, the Amy is not neuron will be inactive, producing 0. And vice versa. Whenever the Amy is not home neuron is inactive, producing an output of 0, the Amy is not home neuron will be active. For some reason, this helps. I could assign roles to you students. I could say, we won't do this, but I could do this. I could say, Abigail, you stand for A. So whenever Amy is home, you produce a 1, and when she's not, you produce a 0. And Aries, you are B for Beth, and Alejandro, you're C for Charles, etc. And then Araceli, you could be the majority net. And Bobby Ray, you could be I'm sorry, Araceli, you could be the majority net for these 3 on the left. And Bobby Ray, you could be the majority net for these 4 on the right. Yeah. And then I could tell secretly, I could tell Abigail, Aries, and Alejandro whether Amy is home, Beth is home, and Charles is home. And I'd only tell Abigail whether Amy is home, no other information, right? And so if I told Abigail Amy's not home, she would give a 0. And if I told Aries that Beth is home, he would have a 1. Sorry. And then I think it was Araceli, who's the majority net over here on the left. You would have to determine based on the 1s and 0s you got from those students whether to produce a 1 or a 0. right? And we could literally do computation this way. You could have a classroom of people just all they know is 1, 0. And then they share that information with um, the student who represents the net. And then that student has a threshold and they just count up the numbers and they decide whether they produce a 1 or a 0. Okay. And then there'd be a student who is the Amy is home student is Abigail. And then someone would be an Amy is not home student, and I'm just randomly picking Caroline. So Caroline, you're the Amy is not home student. So whenever the Amy is home student produces a 1, you know about it, and you produce a 0. And whenever Abigail produces a 0, you know about it, Caroline, and you produce a 1, and you don't know anything else. So green checks if that helps. And even if you already understood it, green checks. So if you already understood it, then it might not help because you already understood it. That's encouraging. But there's still a lot out there who are not responding. Okay, thank you, Isabella. On an iPhone, it's somewhere else, and I've never remembered. Students sometimes chip in and tell us where it is, where the green check is. But I never remember. If you can find reactions, it's under reactions. But maybe the problem is you can't find reactions. Okay. Okay. So um, we can't spend that much more time on this. Uh, and if you have questions, please come to office hours. I'll repeat that sometimes I don't open the hour if I'm doing a lot of things on my computer, but in that case, the email is open and I'll hear the gling and I'll see that someone's interested in meeting and I'll open up the hour. Um, Most of the time it's open and I'm just waiting for people to show up. And those are hours dedicated to students. That's not just we're in the office. That's we're waiting for students to arrive and ask questions. Um, and like I said, I think I said this. I'm one of the fortunate people who I actually like my work. I like my job. So don't show up and apologize for being there. Um, I I like to teach. I like talking about this stuff, and I want you guys to understand it. Okay, so I'm going to clear the feedback. And wait, I did want to say one final thing about the ring and all that. Okay, so I stepped away from a point I was trying to make to go through all that to personify it to say like if you had to act like a majority net, this is how you do it. And for some reason that really helps people. And keep that in mind when you're stuck with something abstract. Ask yourself like if I had to perform this job um, in a game or for whatever reason, what would I do? For some reason, personifying it can help. And I'm going to use that technique later when we discuss deep learning and deep neural networks. Okay. Uh, and so if you had an arrow here, then and it still had the 0 threshold, then A wouldn't matter. This thing would always be active because it's either getting no input is I'm sorry, it's either getting 0 input, which meets the threshold of 0, so it produces an output of 1, or it's getting a 1, which exceeds the threshold of 0, so its output is 1, right? Um, but it doesn't have an arrow, it has a ring, which represents inhibition. Okay. So if it's not inhibited, then it's getting 0 input and it's producing its output of 1. So it's just saying Amy's not home, Amy's not home, Amy's not home. And then Amy gets home, which means A is active and it inhibits the Amy is not home neuron. So I forget if I assigned, okay, so I think it was Abigail is the Amy is not, I'm sorry, Abigail is the Amy is home neuron. And then Caroline Sorry, Bria, I think I skipped you. Anyways, in the alphabetic lineup, alphabetical. So, and Caroline is the Amy is not home neuron. And of course, so Caroline, you know that whenever Abigail is producing a one, you're producing a zero. And whenever Abigail is producing a zero, you're producing a one. Okay. And it turns out that now that we have not and going back and an or, that's sufficient for covering all kinds of other logical operations. And numerically, you can do anything. Okay. We have names for some of them, like we have if then, and we have if and only if. We have what's called XOR, which is exclusive or. We'll see that later. All you need is and or, I should say this, and or and not are sufficient for doing all those things. But in fact, and not is sufficient. So you don't even need all three. You just need the not and one of those. You can do and not, or you can do or and not, and that's sufficient. And then this logician named Sheffer showed that there's a weird operation that we don't have an English word for. And the symbol is not the ampersand for and, it's not the wedge for or. It's called the Sheffer stroke, and it's just a vertical line. And that could do, you can use that one thing to do everything. Okay. And that's just a fun logic point you won't be tested on, but I just wanted to complete the thought. Okay. And so what have McCulloch and Pitts shown? They've they've shown something pretty exciting in the 1940s, okay? And it's something that this is the weirdest thing that somehow everyone forgot in the 1960s. It's so weird. Okay, we'll get to that too. Um, it's like we lost a decade at least of computational advancement because all these people that should have known better, like engineers, people getting into computers and mathematicians and so on, um, forgot this or didn't know about it and were convinced otherwise. Um, so it says here that every net, if furnished with a tape and scanners and suitable, so afferents and efferents, or afferents is the input and efferents, that's the output, right? Um, if they can perform the motor operations, so they can read things and they can send signals, right? Um, uh, they can compute only such numbers as can a Turing machine. Well, we're going to discuss Turing machines, but for now, a Turing machine is an abstract conception that we use to define what can and can't be computed. And Alan Turing made it up in the 1930s. Um, uh, and we'll discuss them later. Okay. Second, each of the latter numbers can be computed by such a net. So they're arguing that if you for any Turing machine, which is equivalent to saying for any computer, forget about quantum computing for now, classical computer. There's a collection of McCulloch-Pitts neurons that can do what it does. And these are very simple things, right? They're just things that listen to ones and zeros and have thresholds and produce output of one and zero. That's it. And they're saying, put these together in the right way for any um, computer that's doing, running all kinds of complex computations, some, 3D video game or uh, computing all kinds of, astronomical data and running large language models that are having conversations with you and all that. Well, there's a collection of McCulloch-Pitts neurons that can do that. Um, and we call that weak equivalence. Okay, I'm going to pause. One thing that people in this field like to do is see if they can analyze and boil down complex problems to basic units. So we saw the field gated field programmable gated arrays mentioned by Gary Marcus long ago in the first week. Um, we we saw the totes test, operate, test, execute, right? As an attempt to break structured behavior down into basic units. And they were thinking, Miller, Galanter, and Pribram were thinking, if we could only, if all we had were these units that acted, that just tested and operated and exited, that's all they do, um, as described, then we could explain all behavior, they thought, right? And now we have McCulloch and Pitts saying, if neurons live up to this standard, that's it. If all they do is this, they can be equivalent to Turing machines. Uh, Grace, P1, P2, and P3 are, I think the P stands for proposition. They're or principle. It's just names, yeah, for the labels. They're just labels. Okay. So because these neurons, as I say here, signal if and only if certain conditions arise, right? Then their activity is inherently meaningful. We use a lot of different names for this: propositional, intentional, semiotic. Uh, I typically just say meaningful. And then they go on and they say, if psychology could analyze mental activity, how do you do that? Well, you're like, why is that person taking the pie from the windowsill? Like in the old cartoons, there's a pie on a windowsill and there's like the scent attracting the person and or the rabbit or whatever. And they steal the pie. Well, they sensed the pie, they saw it, they smelled it. They wanted to eat. They wanted the pie, so and they decided it's worth stealing. Apparently, they weren't worried enough about getting caught. So you take this complex mental state, you try to boil it down into detecting things, and even just sensing a pie, like seeing it, is going to be very complex representation of a pie in your visual field, and that's going to have to break down to all kinds of photoreceptors being stimulated in different ways. And then whether those photoreceptors are stimulated in different ways is going to determine how other neurons, photoreceptors, by the way, are neurons, uh, how other neurons are stimulated, right? And what they're saying is, so you take um, mental activity like that and try to analyze it in ultimate psychic units, and they call them psychons, which is a word that never took. I've never heard anyone talk about psychons, but if you could imagine all mental activity boiling down to psychons, we would find that a psychon could be no less than the activity of a single neuron, no less than that. So then the activity of the neurons is sufficient, they think, for all mental activity. And some people call that the neuron doctrine. But the neuron doctrine gets used in two different ways, for unfortunately. And we saw the other way earlier. So the neuron doctrine earlier was just that the brain's made of neurons, and that's just an anatomical biological issue. But usually today, when people talk about the neuron doctrine, they're asking, are neurons and their activity, are they sufficient to explain our conscious cognitive mental life? And the standard view is yes. But some people say, no, you have to go deeper. You have to look at what's going on a more fine grained level. You have to look at the neuron structure and the microtubules and the quantum states going on in those tubules. And it's at that lower micro level relative to the neuron that you get a complete explanation. I'm going to pause. So in a sense, I said I was going to pause, so I'm going to pause. Okay. Uh, what was I going to say? Um, yeah, I was going to say, so they're, in a sense, they're being very ambitious. They're saying all you need are things like McCulloch-Pitts neurons, and it seems like that's what the brain has. they're not exactly McCulloch-Pitts neurons, but they seem like they're sufficient to play those roles. They You could add a bunch of details, and in fact, we do. We now know that the biological neuron is more than a McCulloch-Pitts neuron, but it's seemingly sufficient for a McCulloch-Pitts neuron. And then in its third bullet, this activity is all or none, 1 or 0, right? Um, then that captures all of two-valued logic. So two-valued logic, also known as, what was it, dialectical? Anyways, it just means true or false. And I'm going to mute. Someone needs to mute, but I'm just going to do it. Okay. Uh, Sometimes people hear, we're only talking about propositions and whether they're true or false, and they think, oh, that means that we can't have shades of gray. Like everything's got to be black and white. There's a sense in which that's true and a sense in which that's way off. Uh, the sense in which it's true is yes, for any particular statement, it's either true or false. So you could think of it as 1-0 or black and white. But that doesn't mean that you can't have uh, a profound amount of nuance and subtlety and all kinds of shades of gray and all kinds of shades of blue and etc. So you're looking at a screen right now that has shades of blue, right? And it's whitish in the middle, and then it's darker blue on the in the corners and on the edges. And that's all produced by ones and zeros, ultimately, right? Uh, and depending on the number of pixels you have, you can have a lot of curved lines and so on. And to the naked eye, you might not even, at a certain distance, you might not even uh, be able to see the pixels. And yes, at some level, you just have ones and zeros, but that doesn't mean that you can't produce a lot of nuance and subtlety and approximate continuity. Okay. Uh, so um, that's the end of the McCulloch-Pitts neuron presentation. And we're about to go into what's called simple detector semantics and look at some of the fundamental questions of how these neurons represent the world, or how anything would represent the world. We're going to get back into what we were looking at um, when I gave the example of uh, of the lamp, right, or the ceiling lamp, right, saying the conditions for my activation have been met, and those, in this case, the conditions are just that there's a switch in the on position for your typical switch, right? And so you could think of the light as indicating something about the world. Now that's not what they're intended to do. They're just intended to produce light so we can see what's going on in the room. But you can think of this as being inherently representational of something. In this case, the switch, right? And similarly, these McCulloch-Pitts neurons, whether it's a majority net or an OR net or whatever, you can think of them as being inherently representational. And they're saying whenever they're active, the conditions for my activation have been met, and now you just need to know what those conditions are. And notice it's a scientific question. You can look at a neuron and see what other neurons feed into it, and you can learn how it gets activated. And they actually experiment. They can individually stimulate, they can stimulate individual neurons and watch how another neuron reacts. Uh, and and so it's a scientific question. So it's kind of a theoretical question that the neuron's activation indicates that its conditions for activation have been met. Okay. Um, but then it's a scientific question of, well, what are the conditions for its activation? Right. And we now know, we've known for decades now, that there are neurons in the visual system very early, like actually in the eye itself, in the retina, that are sensitive to whether other neurons that happen to line up in a row have been activated, right? So you can have an edge detector. And it only gets excited, or it gets most excited when when there's a line falling on the retina in a certain way and activating certain other photoreceptors, right? Okay. Uh, Now at this point, Harnish goes into perceptrons. We'll get to those later. Perceptrons are, I mean, everyone's heard of artificial intelligence, large language models, ChatGPT, et cetera. Uh, these are all deep neural networks of a certain kind. Uh, and the concept of a neural network goes back also to basically to the 1940s, but a little bit after that, you get perceptrons, and those are baby neural networks. Okay. So now we're going to discuss simple detector semantics. And this is a term, as I understand it, it's a term that Harnish comes up with. Uh, in philosophy and cognitive science, there's been a lot of discussion about how to understand mental representation. And more broadly, there's a lot of discussion about how to understand representation. And the natural answer that pops into most people's mind, based on what we've seen already, um, has some problems, it seems, as we will see. Okay. So the question is, how is it that a naturally occurring thing or state of a thing can be about something? So we're saying that the neuron, when it's active, it's about what's something in the world, usually. It's usually out there in the world, but of course, there are neurons that pay attention to what's going on in the gut and like within the body, uh, whether you're feeling an itch or something. Uh, but if I'm looking at the tree outside my window, there are a bunch of neurons activated by that. And I look away and they calm down. And I look at the tree and they get activated again. So there's neurons that are receptive to the greenness and neurons that are receptive to the texture of the leaves and even the frequency with which they occur. Right? There's neurons that get really excited when patterns recur at a certain rate. When you look at tree trunks in the forest, right, you see a bunch of vertical bands that of shades, right? And if the trees were more spread out, there are certain neurons that would get less excited. And if the trees are more clumped together, and so you have more bands with more frequency, there are neurons that just go crazy for that. Okay. Um, okay. So it's so natural to think, well, that's what it's about. It's a vertical band with a certain frequency detector. And there's this other neuron that's a green detector, right? And I don't want to leave the impression that there's just one greenness detector. Like if that neuron died, you'd be unable to detect green. That's not how it works. You have a bunch of, you usually have many neurons that are responsive to these things. Um, and so uh, we so it's I think it's simultaneously obvious and astonishing that something that occurs in nature is about something else. Because so what makes it obvious? Well, aboutness just is something we live with every day. So we have words that are about things, like walk means something. And I actually looked up walk, and I was interested to find that walking isn't just moving with your feet. It has to be moving so that at any time one foot is on the ground. So if you're skipping, you're not walking, and if you're running, you're not walking. I just thought that was interesting. Okay, uh, and and so it's just trivial that that word means something, and that in another language, another word means the same thing. And then you have statements like Fido is sleeping. That's trivial. Those things are about other things. And the thermometer or the sketch that you draw or a blueprint, which is about something that might not yet exist, right? That you can have aboutness in all these cases. And the traffic light is about what you ought to do, what you're legally required to do. Um, and the map is about a city, and the CT scan is about conditions that hold of your brain, right? So aboutness, it just seems like it's everywhere, and it seems kind of obvious. Um, and and yet, if you think like a not just a physicist, but just think like a physicist and just look at the physical world, all these things are made of atoms, and and the atoms are made of subatomic particles, and they're just doing what they do, following the laws of nature. And somehow, some of these things made of atoms are about other things. How does that happen? Well, in all the examples we've seen, we, with our brains, decide to make them so that they behave in ways that are about those things. So we make the thermometer so that the mercury goes up and down in accordance with the temperature. And in the sketch, we want a good sketch is going to be isomorphic or homomorphic. It's going to have similar structure, geometric structure, um, similar to the thing that it's supposedly about. And the blueprint is also going to meet that standard, and so on, right? And then sometimes it's arbitrary. We just say what means that, right? And uh, and so somehow we make these things meaningful. But then how do we do that? And McCulloch and Pitts are trying to say, well, it's the neuron's activity, it's responding to the conditions for its activation. That's where the meaning gets, everything stems from that. And notice that when we're not just thinking of atoms doing what atoms do, and we're just thinking of life, thermometers and blueprints and maps. Um, we watched the baby look at the Minnie Mouse doll going behind the, and so the baby has an experience. What's the experience about? It's about the Minnie Mouse doll. Like that just seems so obvious. And Locke has beliefs about ideas. There's primary and secondary and blah blah blah. And then I give this example because I once had an office mate. He had a dog. He loved his dog, and whenever he would leave his dog in the office. Um, and when I was opening the door, unlocking it, the dog would get really excited. And then it would see me and it would be happy to see me, but not as happy as it would be to see its owner, right? So as we're opening the door, the dog is excited. It has an expectation. It's thinking, this guy's name was Jeff. Is that Jeff? Is that Jeff or my owner or whatever the dog thinks of? We just all think, unless you're like a strict behaviorist or something, that the dog is thinking about something. And then there's evidence of that because depending on who opens the door, the dog gets more or less excited. But even that somehow has to be explained with neurons, it seems. Varla says everything is connected to another in some context. No, I mean it. I'm not sure exactly what you mean, but I mean generally, I think yes, right? There are all these interrelated things going on, uh, and um, I'm just going to return to the point that in a day-to-day sense, when you're not thinking too hard about it, it just seems obvious that things are about other things. But when you try to spell it out and explain how a naturally occurring um, anything could be about something else, it becomes more mysterious and challenging because it seems like nothing else in the universe is about anything that we've ever seen other than neurons. Like, and unless we make it, unless we decide, I'm going to let I'm going to let that tree be about something. I'm going to decide it's about something, or I'm going to let this squiggle represent the word wall, right? Um, and a complex string of those squiggles will mean Fido is sleeping. Or I'm going to build something so that we can use it to be about something like the thermometer. Madeline, don't animals do this too? I would say yes, of course. So I don't just mean the human neurons or the human brain. Sometimes I give examples of human brains, and that's kind of the default. But yeah, the so I don't know how good the research is on this, but um, I read some time ago that dolphins, we know that dolphins squeak and they hear their squeaks and they communicate to a point. Whether you want to call that a language is, I think, partly semantic. Uh, but I read long ago that when a dolphin sends out its sonar and picks up shark, there's a signature that comes back. They hear something that to them indicates there's a shark out there. Maybe it's quite murky and they can't actually see it. Um, I read that they turn around to their fellow dolphins and they make that very sound, right? And I hope that's true. I'm not teaching that it is because I haven't double checked it. Um, but we all want to say, what does that sound about? It's about sharks, right? And bees do this really cool dance when a bee meets another bee. They run around in a kind of a figure eight. They do circles, and the circles turn out one circle is bigger than the other, and so there's a line that points to the direction where they found flowers to pollinate. Um, and apparently, the way they do the dance even gives an estimate of how far away, which is just amazing, right? They're these tiny little things with these tiny little clusters of neurons, and they're able to transmit information like this. And most people in the literature, they'll say, well, that the bee dance is about where flowers are that can be pollinated are. Yeah, cute. And so animals certainly communicate. Uh, and some of that communication is complex and has some of the properties of human natural language. Uh, and they can be trained to communicate and so on. And so we just want to say that these things have representational content, right? Uh, and nothing else seems to have this unless we decide to make it that way. So it doesn't make sense for me to ask you what do carrots mean. And I actually once had students, I made them answer that in a discussion. What does a carrot mean? And um, uh, you get some like poetic desperation, or people will think of like, well, it makes me think of health or eyesight, right? Or or being vegan, right? And you get all these different answers, which shows that there's we associate them with all kinds of things, but they don't mean anything. And you could even look at carrots and do an analysis on the carrot and learn something about the soil in which it grew. Okay, so you can learn things, but you don't say that the carrot means that. It just doesn't make sense. You don't say that a spoon is about something. Again, unless a human decides to make it about something. You could use it as a symbol in a movie, like I just realized that in The Matrix, the spoon is a symbol of the fact that everything's kind of an illusion. Um, so you could do that. But again, uh, that seems to be a product of our neurons, which seem to be inherently meaningful. And then I give the example of the tree because trees, most of them have, or some of them have rings. And so you can look at the rings of the tree by drilling in, getting a sample, and count the rings and figure out how many seasons it's been through or how many years, how old it is, right? But you don't say that like the tree is about its age or that, right? And that it would be weird to say that it could be wrong about that. That tree is false, right? You could say there's a mismatch because sometimes the rings don't perfectly match the age, depending on what the weather was like and all that. But we don't say that the rings are false or wrong, right? And representation seems to require the possibility of misrepresentation. So when I say Fido is sleeping, I could be wrong about that. Someone could go, no, yeah, he's actually right over there, wide awake. Okay. And um, so brains, they're just as physical or even biological as the carrots and the trees and as organs like intestines and lungs. But nothing else seems to be representational. So that's the real question. How is it that brains or their states or their parts can be about anything? Okay. And the naturally occurring answer that faces some challenges and has produced an enormous amount of literature is simple detector semantics, or it's what Harnish calls simple detector semantics. And there's no better name, I think, because it goes by all kinds of other names. Some people talk about indicator semantics or indicator representation, covariation, causal theories of representation or causal theories of meaning, uh, informational theories of representation. My One of my mentors, Robert Cummins, calls them uh, indication. What does he call them? He just calls them indicators. So they go by all these different names, but they all have the same basic idea. And so they're unified by the term simple detector semantics. And that's just that units or sets of them, and we can be talking about anything. We could be talking about neurons, but don't have to be, represent whatever activates them, whatever turns them on, right? And that's what we have McCulloch and Pitts using as their theory of representation. Okay. And this theory is met with some challenges. It was also considered very misguided in the sciences. So in the late 1950s, there's a paper that everyone now calls Letvin et al. And et al is Latin for and others, other people, I think. I forget what AL stands for because it's an abbreviation. Et is and it's just a way of saying that there are other authors. Okay. And so Letvin was the main author, but McCulloch and Pitts were fellow authors. And then Maturana was also part of this. And this is Letvin here on the right in the late 50s or 1960s. And they wrote this paper called What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain, which I think I need to add under the optional readings. So if you want to delve into this history, that's a key article. And their point was that uh, that even early on in the optic nerve, coming from the retina, you get perception, you get meaningful detection. Uh, they studied frogs, and at the same time, Hubel and Weissel um, were doing this to cats. And I'm just curious, has anyone in like a biology class or a neuroscience class or anything like that learned about Hubel and Weissel? Green checks if you have. Yeah. It used to be something that everyone studied. If you were going to study perception, it would usually start with them. Yeah, nobody. Yeah, interesting. Okay, clear. Uh, okay, and what they were doing is looking at activity in the cat's visual cortex when the cat saw certain things. What what Letvin and the others were doing is they had frogs, and they had frogs looking at screens. They were actually um, uh, concave. They were like hemispheres, not brain hemispheres, but they were looking inside a sphere basically. Uh, and everyone had assumed that what happens is whether we're talking about human eyes or amphibian eyes, reptile eyes, mammal eyes, uh, that signals were sent back to the brain. And once they got back to the visual cortex, which is at the back of the brain, occipital lobe, then the processing occurs. And that's where the perception occurs. And what they're arguing is that no, the perception starts right there in the retina, because in the retina you have photoreceptors and neurons, and there are neurons that are picky. They get excited only when certain things happen in the retina, and sending signals back along the optic nerve. Uh, and so they chose frogs because their visual systems are really simple. Their eyes, at least, I don't know much about the frogs, but at least these frogs, their eyes don't move. So they're passive, and we know that frogs respond to visual cues in a predictable way. They hunt by vision. They're triggered only by things that look and move like insects or worms. And a frog will actually starve to death with a worm or a fly or something, a piece of food right next to it if it's not moving. It will just sit there. It will never investigate it, try to eat it or anything. Again, I don't know if that's true of all frogs, but the ones that they were studying, uh, and they're predictable. They'll um, uh, if if you put a shadow over these frogs and there's a dark area, they'll jump right into that dark area, which is good when you're being hunted by, say, a bird of prey, like an owl or a hawk or something. So if something passes by overhead, it jumps into a little hidey hole to get away, right? So they're very predictable. So their systems, their visual systems must be hooked up to a motor system that's pretty predictable. And they have an awareness of there's a hole I can hide in. And then you can, by the way, you don't even have to pass something over them that casts a shadow. You can just dim the lights. If you dim the lights quickly, they'll jump into the hole. Okay. Uh, and what else do I need to um, say? Uh, of course, if something is moving like a bug, then depending on the frog, they either shoot it with their tongue or they jump at it and they bite it. And what they found, sorry, I'm going back. Yeah, good. Uh, when they did this, is they um, I used to have an image of this, but we're close to the end, so maybe I'll draw it later. Um, what they do is the frog would be its visual field would be filled with this hemisphere that's looking into, and they didn't have much in the way of computer screens in those days. They couldn't create computer graphics, of course. So they just had a physical object where they'd have magnets on both sides of the surface. And so you could take from behind, you could move the magnet around on the surface. And so the frog would see something moving and they'd have different shapes. One would be a long line, and one would be a round object that is um, uh, convex, right? And then they tap into the frog's optic nerve, and they could read the activity of these different fibers. So they had fiber one, fiber two, fiber three. They had a bunch of different fibers, and they'd create different visual stimuli using the magnets, moving them. And the fibers, they record what the fibers did. And most of the time, the fibers didn't care because they were only reading a few of them. But one of them, fiber two, was, let me back up. Um, some of them would get excited when something was convex, right? So it was a round magnet in the visual field, and this fiber would get excited, and then you take it away, and the fiber calms down. It's not as active. And then when you dim the lights, another fiber gets really excited, and then you bring the lights back up, and it's no longer excited. And then there were like line detectors. So you just put a line there and it gets excited. And there's even other detectors that are moving line detectors. So when the line is not moving, it's just like that, 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 and then you move the line, it gets really excited. Okay. And then even at that level, axons, that is fibers, coming from the retina, from the neurons in the retina, there was fiber two they thought of as a bug detector. And this is the same guy later. Um, uh, Ledfin. Um, and uh, I might be missing a slide, or maybe they got. Yeah, I think they got mixed up. Okay. So one optic fiber, fiber two, gets really excited when a dark object smaller than a receptive field enters that field, stops, and moves about intermittently thereafter. So intermittently just means a little bit, then it stops, then a little bit again, not necessarily with a pattern. It kind of randomly moves and stops, moves and stops. And a receptive field is for some fibers in your visual field. There are certain areas of your visual field, and some neurons are only sensitive to what's going on in certain areas. So if you have a neuron, the receptive field is the area of the visual field where something that it's paying attention to, that it's sensitive to. Okay. And so fiber two, there might be some area where when an object enters that area, fiber two and acts like a bug, fiber two goes crazy. But if it's acting like a bug over here, fiber two doesn't know about it. And this doesn't, it's not sensitive to what's going on in the background or to changes in light. So it seems to really care whether something's acting like a bug. And you could imagine that that fiber sends signals that end up controlling motor signals, which include jump at that thing and bite it, right? Try to eat that thing. And so their general thesis was the eye is perceiving, not the brain. The eye speaks to the brain in a language already highly organized and interpreted, instead of transmitting some more or less accurate copy of the distribution of light in the receptors. And I just saw that I went over a minute. So we'll pick this up next time. Okay. That's all for today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I'm going to end the recording.
Thank you, Professor.
Have a good one, everyone.
Same to you.